Welcome back, 8 Green students. We are starting Chapter 5, which is titled The Road to Revolution. So we're going to be looking at what are the causes of the American Revolution. And the first topic that we are going to look at is called colonial growing pains. I've used the analogy before in class that the 13 colonies are like the children of the mother country, or England. And right about now, they are in their teenage growing years. Very similar to you guys in that you are starting to push back to your parents a little bit, maybe a little bit of rebellion. And that's what's going on with the 13 colonies right now. So the time period we're kind of looking at is 1763 to 1775. So after the French and Indian War, so the last topic we studied was where Great Britain and France were engaged in a conflict over the Ohio River Valley, and the American colonists were, of course, part of the British Empire, so they fought, did most of the fighting against the French and the Indians. After the French and Indian War, colonists began to protest the Navigation Acts, which we talked about back in Chapter 4. Some new settlement laws we'll talk about, specifically the Proclamation Line, and some new taxes that came from Parliament. Parliament is Great Britain's lawmaking government. Think of it like our Congress. The major issue that is going to continue to divide the British government and the American colonists after the French and Indian War is the question of whether or not Parliament has the right to tax the colonists without representation. And what that means is the colonists did not want to be taxed by a government that they did not have an opportunity to vote for. The colonists were able to elect colonial representatives, and they were okay being taxed by their colonial assemblies, but they did not want to be taxed by the Parliament, which was located in London. Parliament had a few problems. Number one, they had to raise revenue, which is a fancy word for money, government money. They were in huge war debt from the French and Indian War. Debt is when you owe somebody or people or companies money. They needed to get the colonists to obey British laws and stop resisting the new taxes. And they needed to solve a settlement dispute between colonists moving west of the Appalachian Mountains into that Ohio River Valley. And finally, they need to put down an Indian rebellion in the Ohio River Valley. So they just ended a war with the French, and now the British and the American colonists are engaged in a conflict once again in the Ohio River Valley, but this time against a Native American alliance. And this Native American chief was, his name was Chief Pontiac. And so this is known as Pontiac's War or Pontiac's Rebellion. And here's why that Pontiac's Rebellion took place. Number one, the British and the American colonists did not treat the Indians very nicely. The French used to trade with them and give them gifts, and the British and American colonists did not do that. Number two, the British government allowed colonists to settle on Indian lands without any kind of permission. Basically, they won that land in the French and Indian War, and so they just started settling on it. And number three, as the British and the American colonists began to settle west of the Appalachian Mountains, they began to clear forests and destroy Indian hunting grounds. And of course, this was done specifically and more in the Ohio River Valley than any other area. Real quick, brief account of the rebellion. Again, it was a 3-year conflict, but we're going to talk about it here in about 1 minute. Chief Pontiac's alliance used what were called lightning raids, and this is opposite of the non-traditional way of attacking. Back during this time, the European way to fight was basically, I line up my guys on one side, you line up your guys on the other side, we're in a big open field, and we just shoot back and forth at each other. And whoever loses the most men loses that battle. It's kind of a dumb way to fight. The Indians knew that, and so they would use these quick strike attacks, sneak attacks, attack at night, ambushes, and by using this type of fighting, they were able to defeat the British. 8 out of 11 of the British forts were destroyed in the Ohio River Valley. So the Chief Pontiac and his alliance were kicking butt and taking names. And it wasn't until the British, during one of the winters, the British extended a peace offering by giving them some blankets for the warmth, Well, those blankets had come from a smallpox hospital. And so these blankets were infected with the smallpox virus. And so it was basically the first efforts in colonial America of what we would consider biological warfare. Think about our global pandemic today. Imagine if you purposely infected blankets or medical supplies with coronavirus and then gave it to your enemy. But smallpox was way worse than that because coronavirus doesn't necessarily spread as quickly as smallpox did and wasn't as deadly in such a short amount of time. And so we're talking about thousands of Indians dying with just in a few winter months and basically wiping out their entire alliance. The gifts of death is what these blankets were called. Mentioned that, smallpox epidemic. Finally, Chief Pontiac was forced to surrender at a place called Fort Pitt, which today is Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. Over 2,000 British and Americans died during this 3-year conflict. We don't really know the number of Native Americans because the records weren't kept, obviously. Right after the start of this war, Parliament, so that war went from 1763 to 1766. And some people call it a war, some people call it a rebellion. But as it started, Parliament basically passed a new law called the Proclamation Line of 1763. And this was basically an imaginary line drawn kind of down the Appalachian Mountains. And Parliament basically told the colonists, you are not allowed to settle west of the Appalachian Mountains. Well, that's the area that they had just fought 9 years in the French and Indian War to take control of. And Parliament, which again is the government located in London, England, basically said that this land was now going to be reserved for the Indians. So they were trying to kind of appease Chief Pontiac and his Indian alliance. So looking at a map, here are your 13 colonies. This is kind of the Appalachian Mountains, and then it's also the Proclamation Line, this red line. And so here's the area. Remember, this is what they fought over for 9 years to get control of. And they finally got control of it. And as soon as they started settling there, that created conflict with Chief Pontiac and the other Indians living in that area. So then Parliament basically said, let's not settle out there. Let's leave that for the Indians. And so that really upset the American colonists because, again, a lot of bloodshed, a lot of families were destroyed during the French and Indian War to get control of this land, and now they're being told they can't settle there. Also remember that land ownership meant everything to the colonists. Without land, you typically could not vote. You had to be a white male who owned land in order to vote. And again, they fought for this land and they feel like it's being taken away from them. Not to mention, now you're also hurting their pocketbooks. A lot of fur trade was going to be made in that Ohio River Valley. So besides land, fur was obviously very profitable there, and that was being taken away. Daniel Boone. You've probably heard of him. If you've ever been to Booneville, Missouri, it's named after him. Settlers obviously ignored the Proclamation Line, did not really pay much attention to that law, so they illegally started settling out in the western frontier. We call these people pioneers. A pioneer is if you're the first to do something. So the first person to ever go to Mars will be a pioneer of space travel going to Mars. They explored the backcountry. That's a term you should recognize from Chapter 4, also known kind of as the wilderness. King George III, he's the King of England at this time. You're going to hear King George III's name quite a bit over the next couple chapters. King George actually sent 10,000 British soldiers to the colonies to try to enforce the Proclamation Line. Basically set them up like bodyguards along that Proclamation Line. To avoid debtor's prison in 1775, a guy named Daniel Boone decides he agrees to lead a group known as the 30 Guns. Basically think of these as like 30 really big, strong frontiersmen. And they decide to cut through the Appalachian Mountains, and they cut a trail called the Wilderness Road. And that Wilderness Road is going to take settlers into basically what is present-day Kentucky, and he creates the first settlement there called Boonesboro. Within 1 year, American settlers claimed tens of thousands of acres of Indian land in the frontier territory, and they claimed it. Okay, they just basically said, this is our land. So obviously that's going to create a lot of conflict with the Native Americans. Boone helps lead the defeat of another Indian chief named Chief Blackfish of the Shawnee Indian Nation in retaliation for an attack that happened on Boonesboro. And then Boone resettles in Missouri, or what is today Missouri. It wasn't, it was just a territory back then, in 1799, and lived his final years out in the great state of Missouri, or what is Missouri today. By 1800, over 300,000 settlers had blazed the wilderness road into the western frontier. So even though the Proclamation Line was set in place, the American colonists didn't really follow it or obey it, and started settling illegally out in the frontier. This is a picture of what Boonesboro, Kentucky would have looked like. So very similar to what, we think back to chapter 3 in the Jamestown Fort, although the Jamestown Fort was in a triangle, but it basically was a fortified area. So these are houses the people lived in, and these were different storage barns and facilities, and so this was kind of their town, and they have these walls up to protect them from the Native Americans. You can see all the land they would have cleared to create Boonesboro. And that's all I have for today on the growing pains, early growing pains with the colonists. Have a wonderful day.